Yeah.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a person who's been unbelievably important in my life. Hildegard of Bingen dates, at 1086 to 1179. And just to give the context in my life, I am a musician and I did all the music exams and so on, and gradually women disappeared from the composing sphere. I went to Oxford and studied music, and there were no women teaching and no women in the curriculum. So I decided that women didn't do the sort of thing that I wanted to do. And it took me another 15 or 20 years to find Hildegard, who in effect told me that women could do that sort of thing. And so her music has influenced all of my music, and her theology has influenced my own spirituality. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce her to you. I shall do her in two ways. I shall tell her story with me on the screen like this, and then I shall ask Annalisa to let me share the screen, and I will show you some slides. I've done this many times, but I haven't prepared it for today. So I'm searching my memory for the story. I am Hildegard. I know the cost of speaking out, and I know the cost of keeping silent. Hear my story. Perhaps you know me as Hildegard of Bingen, but it was several miles from Bingen where I was born, in the Nahe Valley in Germany, in the year of our Lord, 1098. Do any of you know the Rhineland? Have you been there? Can you nod if you've been to the Rhineland?
No.
One person has. I think you will agree with me, Jill, that it is the most beautiful place. Rich and green, moist and fruitful. The rolling hills stretch as far as the eyes can see, crowned here and there with rocky crags and tall watchtowers, which seem to penetrate the skies. Below, in the deep valleys, there are neat fields and tidy villages which yield ample sustenance for humankind in them, humankind in there. And through it all flows the mighty river Rhine, bringing growth and fruitfulness to the air, and a means of movement and transport for all who live there. They call the land now, I think, the fatherland. How odd. For the earth is our mother. She is the mother of all, for she contains within herself the seeds of all. The earth of humankind contains all verdancy, all germinating power. All things come from it. And it contains not only the substance of humankind, but the substance of the incarnation of God's own Son. Being the 10th child, I was tithed to God and sent at the age of 8 to live in the abbey of on the Rhine. Sent at the abbey on the Rhine. I was sent to live with a woman called Jutta. From Jutta, I learned so many things of spinning and of weaving, but also of the ever-present, all-encircling love of God and of the Holy Spirit, which flows like sap through our bodies and brings growth and fruitfulness to everything. It was a time of learning. We were on the side of a male order. So I didn't get the education that the men got. But I learned Latin in the way of being immersed in the Latin of the Mass and the services. I also learned to see the evil in the world, the sloth and carelessness of the priests, the devastation of the natural world, and also the violence of human beings. And I knew anger as well as joy. From my earliest time, God revealed God's self to me in many different ways, sometimes in words, sometimes in images, sometimes in music, sometimes in all three. I wanted to discuss these visions but my spiritual directors told me that I should keep silent. But ever within me grew the pressure to speak out. But how could I, a woman, be heard? Who would listen to me? Who would find my words in any way useful? But lo, in the 41st year of my life, I was taken up in a vision, and I beheld a radiant light. Everything around me glowed, and in it was formed a voice. And the voice said, "Tell and write what you see and what you hear." And so I stood up. I gave my hand to writing. The words flowed out of me like a torrent. And I, contrary to my previous fears and timidity, I was heard. I called my first book Scivias, knowing the ways. It took me 10 years to write. People heard of me. They wrote to me, Bernard of Clairvaux and the Pope. I wrote to the Pope telling him to remember he was a child of God, and therefore the Crusades might not be a good idea. Gradually around me, Jutta had died, and I was now the leader, the magistra, you might call me, of our community. And we were expanding all the time. But the monks of the Disibode, which is the monastery that we were joined with, they had expanded too, taking up all the land for their farms. Abbot Cuno was implacable. Can you imagine the arguments and the counter-arguments of just not being, and the frustration I had of not being heard? Eventually I was ill, both in body and in mind. And in the end, I and my sisters, we picked up our things and we left the monastery, taking our dowries with us, and went to the Rhine. There I took place on a hill, which I named after my dear St. Rupert. And we started to build. I myself supervised the building work. It has been said we even had piped water. It has been said, I understand, that the body is at war with the soul, but how can this be? God made us as whole bodies, and our souls can only find expression through the actions of our bodies. Indeed, I believe that when the soul and body work together in mutual agreement, they received the highest reward of mutual joy. On the Rupertsberg, I and my sisters explored all wonderful ways of portraying the spirituality of the divine. We even wore coloured robes and golden crowns, as befits the brides of Christ. Not always, I may say, with ecclesiastical approval. And in it and through it runs always the music. For music expresses most clearly the soul's desire for God and the desire to connect with God. But in the last year of my life, the music was silenced. You see, we had buried in the grounds of our convent a young man who'd been excommunicated before he died. But he had confessed before he died, and I thought he was entitled to rest in hallowed ground. I, even though I was old and ill, went out and dug away all traces of the grave so that it might not be violated. The prelates at Mainz wrote and excommunicated me. But even worse than that, they silenced the music. It was a time of great grief and heavy sadness. In the end, inspired in a vision, I wrote to the monks, the prelates, sorry, not the monks, the prelates, saying that those who silence the music of God on earth will have no part in the song of the angels of heaven. The interdict was lifted and the music goes on. I may sing you just a little of the sound of her music. O viridissima virga, Ave quae inventoso flabros giscitationis sanctorum prodisti, cum venit tempus quod tu floruisti in ramis tuis. Ave, ave sit tibi, quia calo solis in te sudavit, sicut odor balsami. This is a part of my wonderful hymn to the Virgin, where I liken her to a greening branch, because in her all the flowers of the earth are growing, and so on. I died in the year 1179, but I do not think that death has silenced me. Some of you may have heard my voice today, but I was ever in fear and trembling, and I ever doubted my own capacity. But I lifted my hands to God, that I might be carried like a feather, without any power or strength on its own, on the breath of the wind. Well, I didn't remember all of it, but I remembered enough, I think, to give you the feel of Hildegard in her convent. So now, if you'll allow me to share the screen, I will share.
I believe you. Yeah, I believe you can share. I don't need to give you permission.
Just looking for it. Share.
That was beautiful, by the way.
Oh, thank you. And let's have a look at that. That's the one we need. Can you see that?
Yes.
I'm going to do it from the beginning. There we are. So there she is in her convent, and you can see the portrayal. These are her own the images are painted by her nuns in the scriptorium. And there you see the very beautiful picture of her. The inspiration of the visions is portrayed, as often in Middle Ages, as fire coming down from heaven. And there, on the other side of the blue wall, is her faithful scribe called Volga. And he was told to write the visions down, but he was not allowed to make any changes in them. He could only improve the Latin. And you see she has a tablet of some kind, and we don't know what she wrote on that or what it was. She may have been drawing the pictures that she was seeing, and so on. And behind her is the nun who possibly had the beautiful voice, and so on, although Hildegard undoubtedly sang herself. That's the main manuscript, the Reason Codex, which lies in Wiesbaden in the bibliothèque there. These are the layout that I've chosen. I'll take it through relatively quickly. Through all of her thinking runs the notion of viriditas, or greening power. And remember, the Rhine Valley is very green because often there's mist over it. And that's the vibrancy and energy of all creation, and so on. That's the present convent. No dream tree blooms without greening power. So that greening power runs through the ground, it runs through us, and so on. And she saw that God created the world in right relationship. And this is her comment on her vision of the angels, that God wonderfully formed and ordered his creation. And in a sense, the role of music is basically to join creation back together in right relationship. She's a woman of her time, the medicine of her time. You see there one of the drawings, the medical text there. You see the remedies that she created. She was she created herbs and so on. The medicine of the time was dominated by Hippocrates, and Galen had made Hippocrates and the ancient Greeks more available. And in that you had the doctrine of the four humours, the Greek medieval theories of four elements, the basis of the theory of medicine, and now used as a psychological typology. Each of the humours associated with particular characteristics, and it was elaborate classification of types of personality. There are the four humours, all associated with the earth, yellow bile with fire, black bile, which nobody knows what she meant by that, earth, phlegm, water, blood, air, and then you have people who are hot, dry, cold, or wet, depending on which of the humours are dominant. There we see the more worked out black bile. If you've got a lot of black bile, you're melancholic. The organ that's dominating is spleen, and so on. You've got, they're normally in balance. Too much of a humour causes disease, and the cure is by rebalancing the humours, and so on. It's very similar to a Ayurvedic medicine, and so on. And there we see some of her writing. A person's blood are affected by the time of the moon's movement. The air moves to good or bad weather following the moon, and so on. So very much a sense of the moon controlling it all. And this is particularly beautiful. She's one of the first people to write about childbirth and conception. But in the infusion of the soul into the fetus, remember, she had no x-rays or anything, so she's looking at how she sees pregnant women, that she sees the perfectly describing how every joint and limb is separated out in the fetus, and what she sees is that the soul, while the baby is in the womb, is gradually being infused into the baby, and when the soul is completely infused, then the baby is born. But I love, if we look further down this, where it says, for the living wind, that is, the soul enters the form according to the will of Almighty God, strengthens it, makes it capable of life, and wanders around within it like a caterpillar that spins silk, from which it becomes covered and closed in as a house. When she's writing, you don't know whether she's writing poetry or whether she's writing medical texts, and so on. So all of the writings are using a huge variety of art forms together. I'm not going to go in. I'm going to cut this down a little. The place of music, she sees music as being God being music. Praise the Trinity, our life-giving music. She is creating all things. Life itself is giving birth. She is an angel chorus praising the splendor of arcane mysteries, which are too difficult to understand. Also from her true life springs for all. They're all written in Latin, so on. Music expresses the unity of the world as God first made it, the unity which is restored through repentance and reconciliation. They're written as, the music is written in neumes. That's the picture of the neumes. Those are shaped notes, but as you can see, with no tails, still used to a certain extent in plain chant. She's using the 4 lines that we would see there. You see more of it there. And there's the transcription in a way that those who read plain chant can read, and so on. Singing, as you hear, was very important to her. The words of a hymn represent the body, while the melody represents the soul. Words represent humanity and melody represents divinity. Thus, in a beautiful hymn in which words and melody are perfectly matched, body and soul, humanity and divinity are brought together into a unity. All of these, I'm going to come to the vision in the pictures, but all of those are her visions. She almost certainly didn't paint them. The nuns painted them under her instructions. It's there. The theology, she sees both the temporal material inextricably bound up with the invisible and the eternal. Her visions, she appears to have what appear to be moving visions. Today, I'm sure she would have made film videos of them. And this, here you see her writing the description of it. I saw a bright light, and in this light, the figure of a man, the color of sapphire, which was all blazing with a gentle glowing fire. And that bright light bathed the whole of the glowing fire, and the glowing fire bathed the bright light, and the bright light and the glowing fire poured over the whole human figure, so that the 3 were one light in one power of potential. And that's the description we see in italics. And then she does a description of it. The bright light designates the fire, while the figure in sapphire blue without flaw, the sun, the glowing fire is the Holy Spirit. That's the image, the most famous image that she uses that she was describing. Other people interpret it differently now. And it's much used as a symbol of humanity now. People use it as a mandala, You see the human figure in the middle, but you see the opening of the fontanelle into the divine, the fire and the divine creator. Often called, that is called the figure in sapphire blue. It's another vision where you see the world as the body of God. You see the image of the heads of God at the top, but that we're all enclosed in the body of God. And so she sees all creation as part of the body of God. You see the human being in the middle. You see the winds blowing in. You see the water circling round and the fire on the outside, and so on. She signs the pictures by painting a little picture of herself, as you see in the bottom left-hand corner. That's cosmic humanity and so on. Here's another one. This shows the wheel of the seasons. You see people sowing and reaping still within that fire, and you see always earth, air, fire, and water in it all, and so on. The cosmos as a network of interrelationship within the energy of God, within an enclosing fire, and so on. The contemporary theologians have picked this up, and the notion of remythologizing the gospel for our time is the metaphor of the world as God's body. But that's not new. That comes from the Middle Ages. And with the doctrine of humours, it was much easier to see the world as God's body rather than the way that it developed post-Protestantism and the Enlightenment. And we have this, just as the creator loves the creation, so does creation love the creator. Creation was designed to be beautifully enriched, to be lavished, to be richly endowed with the love of the creator. The whole world has been hugged by this kiss. The crucifixion does not feature very highly in her thinking, unlike 200 years later when it was going to feature much more highly. But here you see the crucifixion is at the center of the universe. You see the collection of the blood and then that coming down into the altar. And you see the significance of female figures, in a sense, 2 female figures and so on. In that, and wisdom is she sits in a line of wisdom theologians, in which the Virgin Mary is crucial. The first planting of the green seed of the patriarchs and prophets, she was graced with the dazzling virginity of the Virgin Mary, and next with the solid and ruddy faith of the martyrs, by which God and neighbours should be loved. And she writes of wisdom, she will go on this way until the end of the world, and her warning will not cease, but will flow out always, as long as the world endures. In the end, she develops a theology of virtues, and so she almost develops a female trinity. And this is her picture of the female trinity, love, humility, and peace circling around. And that's wisdom is made up of love, humility, and peace. Humility, of course, meaning not what we often regard as humility, but of the earth. And there's Caritas, who's the sort of single figure who becomes the female of the divine, yes, that's right. And Caritas described in her antiphon, strengthening love, blooming in everything, at her most excellent in the deeps and the rising stars, the most fascinating heart of all things, because she has embraced the highest sovereign in peace. So I love this. Her best bit of theology is Ordo Virtutum, the play of the powers. This was almost certainly done by her nuns at the opening of the convent on the Rupertsberg, and then they would have dressed in costumes, as you heard in the story. It's that there's the soul who's trying to become divine, and then you have all the virtues which you see portrayed there as nuns. There's love and chastity and hope and victory, and all the virtues come on and they sing, I am hope and this is what I do, and then I am love and this is what I do, and I am victory and this is what I do. A perfect opera, really, for a group of inexperienced women, really, on the Rupertsberg. Almost certainly Hildegard played the soul, and the virtues are all around the soul and give her the cloak of faith. And then the devil appears. Everybody sings, it's all sung, except for the devil who speaks, because the devil is not connected to God, so he speaks, because it's singing that connects you to God. It may even be a faithful priest friend who came and played the devil. But in the end, the devil wins, and Hildegard the soul throws off the robe of faith and goes off with the devil. Meanwhile, the virtues all assemble themselves into a sort of group to get the soul back from the devil, and eventually they succeed in getting her back, and the devil is chained in front of the altar. It is really quite a remarkable piece, although morality plays were not uncommon in the Middle Ages. This is an opera. It's fully sung from beginning to end, except for the role of the devil. And really her theology is expressed in that. She's a virtue theologian, and wisdom is made up of virtues. There's the vices and virtues. She sees this is quite a remarkable piece of theology. She sees the vices and virtues as inextricably bound together. And so the caritas can be twisted into the vice envy, but the answer to envy is not to ban it, but to untwist it into its rightful form of caritas. So everything is connected in hers. There's nothing that has to be sent away, just has to be put into right relationship with itself and so on. It's a very, very holistic view of morality based on her wisdom theology. This is the fallen stars image. And this is one of the ones which has led people like the man who took his wife to say that what she was suffering from to get these visions was a form of migraine. And those people who have migraine say that those stars images are part of it. But what Oliver Sacks says in the small chapter he writes about the relation of the visions and migraine is that does not invalidate what she was given in the visions. They can be both migraine and truth as well. This, the fall, which has been part of Christian theology, many people say there is no fall, and Matthew Fox put out the idea of original blessing, and certainly she thinks that we're all originally blessed, but there is a fall, and you see there her picture, which she sees as the fall, but of course the person is falling into a garden. So again, it's a very interesting piece of theology, which is not a condemnatory one, but one of blessing. Her view of herself, I'm a mere poor woman, a vessel of clay. What I comes not from me, but from the clear light. Man is a vessel which God fashioned and filled with his inspiration. This is a common line in women's authority and visions in the Middle Ages. When God speaks to her in that vision in the 41st year, dust of dust, ash of ashes, God speaks. As women could have no authority in the world, so they couldn't be bishop of or professor of, they in general, this is a wonderful ploy, because if they are uneducated and also have no spiritual authority, then everything they have must come directly from God. And so that is part of the notion of how women claimed authority of some kind. She loves female figures. Here she sees the figure of synagoga, who's holding all of people in her, in the Jewish tradition, and so on. And she gives way to the figure of Mother Church, who holds everybody together. And here we see the image of Mother Church holding everybody in her arms. The bride of Christ and the mother of the faithful. I must conceive and give birth. And this way she links with some contemporary theologians who say that an area called Tohomic theology, which is that creation doesn't happen just once at the beginning of time, but that we live in a big womb, which is continually creating, and so on. There's another version of ecclesia linked to the heavens by means of the pipes, so on. And this is how she describes her visions. I see things by means of my soul, for I do not hear with my outer ears, nor by the reasonings of my heart, nor do I perceive by any collation of five senses, but directly into my soul, with my exterior eyes wide open. I never fall into weaknesses of ecstasy, but have visions while awake, both day and night. She saw the visions as making her sick. She has the visions from the age of 3. And I suspect her parents were merchants. They were probably quite glad to give this visionary child to the convent, and so on. There is a visionary experience again with Volga there, and so a different image of her scratching on her pad there. And there's the vision of the angels, again, a vision that many people use for their own prayer. You have the 9 orders of angels, as in Thomas Aquinas, and there you see the lovely circle in the middle, which is the infinity of God, and so on. Notice that she will draw a frame, as many of the painters of the Middle Ages would, but then Hildegard, who is always too big for everything, really, a large figure, then takes the circles outside the frame. So that very ebullient personality is revealed in the images that she's receiving as well. And there are the angels, the 9 orders. Now, one of the things I think is interesting, and this is going from her to her relevance for today, a desire to see the visionary experience as salutogenic rather than pathogenic. And I'm almost sure that Hildegard and Julian, other of the medieval mystics, would be locked up if they were alive today, because these visionary experiences are now regarded often as pathogenic, although there's a move not to see them. And we've heard this in many of the accounts in this SIG and so on. We have a mass of medieval mystics, Mechtilde Magdeburg, Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kemp, and then, of course, going on to William Blake, and so on. Bernadette of Lourdes is the last, really, of the sort of well-known visionaries. And just around there, people are beginning to pathologize. We see it in one of Bernadette's visions, where she scratches in the ground, where the beautiful lady tells her to dig in the earth and find a spring. She can't find a spring, and initially, and everybody says she's mad. And then the next day, the spring of Lourdes appears, and of course, she's not mad anymore, and so on. So there's the power of wisdom, and I love her idea of wisdom. You encircle all things. You are embracing everything in a way that brings life into being. For you have 3 wings. One of them reaches highest heaven, and another is sweating in the earth, and the third is flying everywhere. Therefore, it is right to give you praise, O Sophia wisdom. And I haven't prepared enough to sing that one today. There's a very, very beautiful image of wisdom. So I'll stop the share and very happy to initiate a discussion if anybody would like to ask me any questions.
Well, I mean, June, considering you weren't even supposed to present, I mean, that was amazing. It was, well, you clearly know this very, very well, but still, you know, you saved the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. I could see your clapping. It would have been more polished had I prepared it more carefully, but
it's good. I was just wondering if what happened to women mystics after the Middle Ages, because I know there were several in the Middle Ages, but then somehow women seem to disappear from certainly the Catholic.
Well, a number of things happened. The women's mystical tradition depended on the convents. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, then you had to have it off with your spouse. So most of your childbearing years were spent bearing children, rearing children, losing children, mourning children, even dying in childbirth. So the notion of espousing a vow of chastity in the Middle Ages freed you up. So the line of women poets, of women theologians, of women composers runs through the convents. It's at its best. It's at it. What people have heard even less of are the Italian communities with Cozzolani and people like this, who were in northern Italy in the 16th century. What happens after that? Protestantism was a disaster for women because it took away the conventual tradition, and it meant that every woman was now tied to a husband, which meant that it was extremely unlikely. We have people like Clara Schumann saying, before I married Robert, I thought women had some creativity in them. Now I've married Robert, I know that women shouldn't compose. And of course, Robert was depressed and there was no time to compose. whereas the conventual tradition allowed women to compose. Hildegard writes in one of them, of the Virgin Mary, "I wish that my closed-up womb could bear a child like yours did." And of course it did. Her closed-up womb bore all of those books of theology and all of that music, which would have been impossible if she'd borne children, and so on. Protestantism was an Enlightenment project. It was very rational, and therefore the visionary experience, which was regarded as irrational, became increasingly problematized. Not so much for the Roman Catholics as for the Protestants, but I often, when I do this presentation, a number of women come up to me and they say, very tentatively often, "I've heard that music and I've seen those visions," and that they've never dared to tell anybody for fear that they will be pathologized, and so on. And so the Enlightenment and its heavy stress on rationality meant that everything that was broadly intuitive actually got, people were suspicious of it. There is a movement in psychiatry now to actually look at the visionary experience and so on. But, so I think what happened was the stress on marriage, the loss of the ability to enter a convent and be chaste in some way. And still in many of the conventual traditions, and it's not well enough known, I think, that they're still creating music in their convents for their liturgies and things like this. It's just not as well known as the men. I am an associate with the Benedictine sisters in West Malling, the Anglican Benedictines, and they're a wonderful musical tradition because the Mother Superior had been a gold medalist pianist in the Royal Academy, and she created all the musical tradition. And people say, what a shame she went into a convent. I say she would never have had that chance anywhere else in the world other than being a Mother Superior for convent, not at the beginning of the 20th century. So where did it go? It went into marriage, straightforward. It's maybe a bit hard, but
Does anyone have questions?
I think it's true, June. And I know that certainly, my own experience even of prayer and yours, like if I was to, like that sense of images and pictures that can come, I can't draw a straight line without a ruler. But I get the very, very vivid images that I can get. And like that, I say, you could be locked up if you said them out too loud.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. It took me a long time to declare mine. I felt very like her. You kept them very quiet because she didn't speak until she was 41.
Mm-hmm.
And Bernard of Clairvaux, it was very, very interesting because Bernard of Clairvaux, she wrote to him and she wanted him to help her with the visions. And he sort of dismissed her as a sort of, look after your nuns, but don't get involved in this stuff.
Yeah.
In the end, the Pope hears of her, and I left that bit out of the story, and he investigates her and finds her competent and authentic. Mm-hmm. And once the Pope actually affirms her, then the people start coming to her, and so on. But she needed that affirmation from the Pope to get.
Which is ridiculous.
Yes, that's right.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the story, isn't it? It's
I
the
know.
Story of women still.
Yeah,
you need the big man to say that you're okay before you can believe that you're okay. And that still goes on, I'm afraid. It goes on in supervision, PhD supervisors who, have to affirm it and often take the work over as their own anyway. I mean, we're not far from this, really.
No.
And in fact, as the abbess of a convent, she had more power in the church than women do in the Roman Catholic Church today.
Absolutely, yeah. Until she was silenced over the fact that she continued to give spiritual direction to the young man who was.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and her visions, I mean, she wasn't very popular with the local clergy because she said, you know, why should a priest have a cloak and a coat? And why not give one of them to the lay people, because they have got babies and all sorts of things and they need them. And so she was very angry about the rich having all the riches and the poor having nothing.
Mm. And nothing has changed.
Yeah, absolutely. People often ask me if I'm discouraged by that, but I think I find real trouble with evolution and with linear views of humanity.
Yeah.
Because I think they're circular. And as women, what we have to do is to make sure that that women's slot is not lost in the circle.
Mm-hmm.
We must keep being there in one way or another, and so on. Because, you know, we're still wrestling with the same things when we look at those women in the past.
And sometimes the people that keep us down are other women.
I think that's a huge problem for our age. You know, there's a sort of, it not only works in the area of disadvantaged women, but also disadvantaged ethnicities.
Yeah.
And you see it in the present politics, really. You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
pull the ladder away, Jack, I'm all right. So I'm the person, I'm the disabled person, I'm the one woman, I'm the person from a different ethnicity. And therefore, there's only one of us we can have. Therefore, I'm going to make the others out because they might take my place away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's lovely for you to share. Yeah. And in a sense, she didn't paint her visions either. It was the nuns and the scriptorium that did. And we haven't got the original paintings. They were put away into safekeeping, as many paintings were in during the war, probably somewhere in Russia. But fortunately, someone had made a huge copy of them. So the manuscript has the copies of them all, which were made before the war in the early 20th century. And the thing that we don't know is that this light which filled all the visions, somehow or other, she managed to mix silver into her paint to portray the light.
The light.
And that's very difficult because silver tarnishes.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to use silver. And as we haven't got the original, we can't know how she did manage to mix the silver in. But this radiant light she did in a way that nobody appears to have done. Similarly, in the music, she's using some symbols which nobody else uses. And so it's very difficult. She was a real innovator. She was doing, you know, things that other people hadn't done, and so on. So, and I think the loss of the religious orders now is going to be a huge loss for women's creativity. You know, the decline in the women's orders.
Yeah, I agree.
A huge loss. Because
I think religious life gave an expression that women didn't otherwise have.
Yeah.
Even in terms of the, you know, giving them the opportunity to work as nurses and teachers and social workers. Now they opened that up for women generally, and now nobody is coming to the religious life to do it.
I think it's wonderful. I stay at the Benedictine, the Roman Catholic sisters in Eibingen. When they appear in the chapel, they're all in their habits.
Yeah.
Out of the back windows, you can see them driving the tractors and tending the vines, as they always have done. They're a wonderful vine-producing order.
Yeah.
And I used to have to walk past the shop to get to the chapel from the guest house, and I went in there, and the sister said, "Oh, June, a terrible thing happened today. Someone stole one of our liqueurs." Oh, I said, "Sister, how terrible." She said, "Well, I feel terribly guilty because we only put chamomile tea in the show bottles." So when they'd stolen this immense liqueur, they found that they'd got a bottle of chamomile tea.
Oh, chamomile tea.
They thought these nuns were not in this world, but they were very much in this world.
Oh, stop. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah. No, there's something about. And we won't realize we've lost it until it's gone completely.
Yes, and I don't know. I think I just think now, I mean, I wish myself, and I've never been a religious, although I did consider it, I think if one had had sort of temporary vows where people could go in for, say, 20 years or that sort of thing, it might have lasted much more, not in the form that we have now. But, I mean, I'm just so sad to see those orders going. I mean, I think we've lost a big, people say they were enclosed, but actually the enclosure made them free.
Absolutely, yeah, this is it. And people, even in terms of, you know, understanding of vows themselves, you know, it's one of the things that we look at, that the vows, the vows free you for, the free you from, but the free you for.
But there was a wonderful, when I was in the States once, I stayed with a wonderful liberal order in the South. And they gave me the real meaning of chastity. They said to me, you're not free. You've got 2 children. And whatever you do, you've got to consider your 2 children and so on. Our bodies are free. So they had cut the chains on the nuclear thing and got put in prison. They had rowed little boats in front of the deliverer of the nuclear submarine. And they'd been imprisoned over and over again for fighting for justice, because we can use our bodies for what we think is right. You can't. Once you've born children and you have a family, you have other bodies which are attached to yours, so you're not free.
Commitments.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's where I saw the value of chastity, value of that vow. It's not negative, it's a positive.
Oh, it's
free.
very much a positive, yeah.
That's right. So, you know, and she rated chastity very highly. And as she writes to the Virgin Mary, she looks, she wants to bear children, but she did. She bore all those things. I see Judith wants to come in.
I do, thank you. And just thank you, that was marvellous. And I'm sorry, what's her name? And actually, I worked out why she hasn't turned up. It's the middle of the night there.
Ah, right.
They're 12 hours in front of us. No, yes, behind, somewhere. But anyway, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning or something. On the chastity thing, I did want to come across information that their chastity, which I know is practiced by men as well, if you really practice chastity, then not only does it have the freeing psychological thing, but it frees up the energy. So the spiritual energy, if it is going to rise, it won't get stuck down there, it will rise.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, as with Kundalini or whatever. On the silver, I just suddenly, as you spoke about it, June, and I have no idea whether this would work, but I wondered about Mercury. I'm not a chemist, whether she was, because there's the amalgam thing, and then you get all into the, what's it called, alchemical side of it. So whether she was literally experimenting with that, and whether she managed to fix it in some way. So that
well, certainly she was a herbalist, so she knew a lot about herbs, and she, of course, was in favour of hemp. And when every time there's a desire to legalize cannabis, I'm asked to refer to the bit in Physica where she talks about the healing power of hemp and so on and so forth. So she writes in detail about lots of herbs and how to make cakes for digestion. And so she was a great herbalist, really. And what is interesting is she writes treatises on herbalism and health, but it's linked with theology. You know, God made the world in right relationship and so on, and therefore this is how these herbs help right relationship. So whereas the traditional medical thesis, even in the Middle Ages, was about the body and things, she links the whole thing together. All her thinking is linked together. It's all interrelated. So you're absolutely right. People call her the first European scientist. So she obviously, you know, did know an awful lot about plants and herbs and mixing and all of that. And in Germany, when I first went to Bingen, and I used to sit at the restaurants to translate I've translated the Latin into English in a way that fits the original music. They knew her as a herbalist. They didn't even know she'd done any music or any art. So she was in that string of holistic medicine in Germany, which interestingly, Hitler had, of course, sanctioned a strand of alternative medicine, and she fitted in that. And it's only later that her vision, that her paintings and her music have become better known there. They are now, and it's a great tourist site, but it wasn't when I first went there. She was a herbalist, and you could go to
you have a picture of a pot of pills, didn't you?
That's right. Yes. Yes. I think,
and it would have fitted in with the humours, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
And their ideas about medicine. The other thing
just the joy of the humours before you ask the next is wonderful, because if somebody comes to consult you and they're ill, first of all, you have to work out whether they're a fiery, a watery, a hot or a cold person. And then you have to look at the weather and see whether it's hot, cold, wet or dry. Because if you're a hot person on a cold day, it won't be the same as a cold person on a cold day. And only when you've made the weather and the person should you prescribe the remedy. When we lost the doctrine of the humours, we lost all that relationship. And we know that in medicine, it's wrong just to treat the body that's sitting in front of the person. There are all sorts of things happening around them which may be affecting their humours, which in general people aren't taking account of. So I think it's, we have a lot to learn from the humours. Anyway, Judith, do carry on.
I wanted to ask you about when you sang. You were singing a lot faster than I've normally heard plain song or chanting, which I assume...
Well, today, as I had to do it on the spur of the moment, I would normally sing the whole of that antiphon, but I'm tired and I haven't rehearsed it. I had to dredge it from my memory. But she was undoubtedly a very dramatic person. The first recording of the music was done it was called Feather on the Breath of God, and it was done like traditional plain chant. But she was an exuberant person, so I tend to sing it with more drama than the traditional plain song. And as we don't know how it was sung, also the other thing I did today, because I'm older and because I'm tired, I also sang it low. Whereas we used to hearing it high. But then Hildegard was 81 when she died. And as you get older, your voice sinks. So, the note, and when we hear the beautiful recordings that we've got, recorded by numerous people now, her nuns weren't selected because they were singers. They were selected because they had a vocation. Granted, if you sing, 6 times a day, you're going to be better at it. But the notion that they were all these perfect voices is probably far from the truth. So I do sometimes sing it low, as I did today. And, I suspect that's how Hildegard sang it when she was 81, because that's how and often when I don't know whether you would agree with me in the religious order, but if I go into the religious orders and you hear them, you hear the cantricks blow the pitch pipe, and it's not going to work, because a lot of the sisters are well over 70, and that there's no point in setting the pitch as it would have been when you were 22. And therefore what you're going to hear is a whole load of older nuns being asked to be quiet. Whereas I felt like saying to them, if only you'd pitch it a fifth lower, they'd all be able to join in. Would you agree with that?
That was a point I was going to make, but maybe in not such a musical way, because when I've been on retreat, I went down to some sisters in Arundel once, and they were all, bless them, they were all piping away in these little old ladies' voices. But I've got one of those now. So,
well, there's another thing, Judith, and that's another thing that our society has done, even to Hildegard, and that is, why is the young woman's high-pitched voice regarded as the beautiful voice, And why is the mature woman's voice not regarded as a beautiful voice? I mean, the women's barber's shop use it. I mean, the older women there even call themselves basses. I say that if you've lived a bit, you've got what I call the wisdom notes. La 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 la. And I think, you know, why should we despise the wisdom notes? You get them when you've lived. You know.
Oh, June, you're making me cry. That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Oh, thank you ever so much, and thank you for recording it as well, because I can go back and have another look and take it at my pace. I know you took it at
but I
very
think
fast.
one of the saddest
Thank you
things
very much for doing it.
for the church was that, and I have been rather critical of Protestantism, and I am a Protestant priest, so I can be in a sense, but one of the things that was lost, the only time that you saw women being advertised on a board outside a church was Methodism, where in the Methodism, when I was a child, and that was the 1940s and 50s, you would have preacher, the reverend, what have you, soloist, Mrs. Smith, who will sing Bless This House. And so they did have a female soloist who sang with the very voice you're despising, often a lot of vibrato and a lot of passion. And we've lost it. And even women despise it, but why? Why are we despising the old woman and what she can do? She has the wisdom. You know, don't despise it, use it.
I do usually sing alto, Juno. I must admit now.
I sing the hymns. I sing some verses an octave down. And so occasionally I can find my little girl's voice and sing up. But I tell a sad story, actually, of a friend of mine who became a nun, and she'd been an opera singer before she was, I can see your lips pursing, yes. She thought she had a voice to offer God, and she went into the convent and tried to sing in her operatic voice. And they said, you can't use that voice in here. And she felt really, really upset that she had to sing in this very quite pinched little girl voice, when in fact she had this big, you know, Valkyries type voice. I see you nodding.
Yeah.
So the sounds women are allowed to make are also very limited. Very limited.
And they had to be the same.
Absolutely.
You know, there was a thing of the way even that you were allowed to read. You had to read the same as everybody else.
Absolutely.
You know, it was.
Absolutely.
Eilish, can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
Are you a nun?
I'm a daughter of charity.
What is that? Is that the same as a...
Well, no. Yes and no. We're not nuns.
Oh, it's a layman.
We are Society of Apostolic Life and Community. We're not... Vincent de Paul, when we were founded, if we had been seen as nuns, we would have been cloistered.
Yeah.
Basically, what happened was back at that stage, the writ of Trent did not run as far as France for most things, but like everything else, when it came to women, it did. And one of the things from Trent was that women religious had to live in the cloister. And Francis de Sales and Jane de Chantal founded a community, and their name gives them away. The idea was that they'd be out visiting the people that needed to be visited. They're called the Visitation Sisters. And as soon as they started making vows, the institutional church said, can't have this, you have to be cloistered. So to this day, there is a group of enclosed nuns called the Visitation Sisters. And if that's not an oxymoron, I'm not quite sure what else is. But so when the first group that Vincent founded was a group of lay women in Châtillon in 1617. And it was after he preached, and he was to go out. They were ordinary women in the parish, and he organized them because he had preached about a family who were, everybody was sick and they had nobody to look after them. And he came, when he went up to visit the family himself, people were coming and going. This was August in France, and you know what the heat in France can be like in August. And there were no fridges in the 17th century. So everybody comes with food today. It's going to be ruined by certainly the day after tomorrow. So he knew that charity and that response of charity in that way needed to be organized. So he called together the women in the parish. He knew who to get to organize it. He didn't call the men, he called the women. And they would take a day each to look after this family. And then they could look after other families. And they became known as the confraternities of charity. Mm-hmm. And in Paris, it was the rich women, the ladies, they called themselves the ladies of charity. And they started visiting the sick in Paris itself. But sometimes their husbands and sometimes some of themselves felt it was beneath them to go into the hovels of the poor people. And they started sending their servants. And the servants weren't always as nice to the people as Vincent would have wanted them to be. And at this stage, he had linked up with Louise de Marillac, who was a young widow. And she would have, and girls were coming to, when the priests were going around giving missions in the country areas, there were girls coming saying, we want to help, we want to help. And they would be organized to send them up to Louise, Mademoiselle Legrage, she was known as. And she would have brought the girls together much quicker than Vincent, because he was aware of what had happened to the visitation sisters. And then one of the girls that came up was a young girl from Sursène. She was a shepherdess. She had taught herself to read by stopping passers-by and asking them, what's that word? What's that word? After she had learned to read, she started teaching other little girls to read. So when the mission came to her area, she said she wanted to. So she was up to Paris, she goes, and she was looking after somebody who had the plague and took him into her own bed. So as a result, she got the plague and she died. So Vincent's left with two extremes. We create a religious community, they're cloistered and there's nobody to serve the poor people. We let them all in this unbridled zeal and they succumb to death and there's nobody to serve the poor people. So there's a letter that he writes back to Louise in September after his retreat in 1633. And he says to her, your angel was talking to my angel. We need to talk. So in November 1633, the first group of girls came to live with Louise in her house. And at that stage, they were simply seen as a specific confraternity of charity. But in all, yeah, and there's loads of letters written to bishops, you know, that if bishop asks you, are you religious, you say, by the grace of God, my Lord, we're not, you know. And so they were able to do so much more because they weren't. And then when they started making vows, the way that the vows work was, and it's still to this day, we take vows for the first time when most religious would be taking their final vows. And then we remake our vows every year on the Feast of the Annunciation.
Visitation, yeah.
Now, we wouldn't be allowed to make them the first time if the understanding wasn't that they were for life. But legally speaking, we're only bound for a year.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's how Vincent's pragmatism got round the writ of Trent.
Well, it's a very interesting one because the orders, you've got the nuns, the Hildegard nuns, and they are encloistered sisters. I've only once been back behind into but they're apostolic orders, and that's yours an apostolic.
Yeah,
order,
very much so.
But in the just to go back on the business of chastity, the Protestant tradition got rid of all the monasteries and convents and so on. But then at the earlier 20th century, you had a similar move that you just described, which is very interesting, from the Sisters of the Church in Protestantism, and Mother Emily, who said that these women, you know, they were always going to be apostolic. They were a teaching order. They set up schools. But the church was very critical of them, because the church by then had said all women should be married and bear children. And so she got slated for saying that she would have a religious order with chastity and they would be teachers. And she had to fight really hard to restore that notion in the Anglican Church.
Right.
Because it had been destroyed, and because Protestantism said all women should be married, and moreover, that all women should obey their husbands. So it really was, if you wanted to silence women, it was a really good ploy.
Yeah.
By making sure that one man controlled one woman. And you couldn't have a much greater control than what Protestantism offered women, really. And what is interesting in Protestantism is that where you see women actually rising again is in hymn writers. They wrote hymns. And that was one of the things that they could do.
The creative dimension. The
creative dimension. And the best one that I love, just to tell what the story is, there's a hymn that's "Just as I am, without one plea, O Lamb of God, I come." Feminists don't like it because they say it's all very, very humble and things like that. But it was written by a woman who was disabled, and Victorian disabled women couldn't go out.
No.
And all the family had gone to the church fete. And so she wrote this hymn in anger. Just as I am, though I'm disabled, I'm still coming, folks. You know, I mean, it's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
If you look at the hymns they wrote, they are they're unbelievable. That's another story. I've written a lot on the Victorian hymn writers.
But in some ways as well, Vatican II, while it was within the Catholic Church, it actually freed up the Protestant churches as well to a large extent.
Oh, well, you produced a mass of hymn writers, people like Bernadette Farrell.
Yeah.
Vatican II released a whole raft of women's creativity. They were the singer-songwriters, women singing with guitars.
Yeah.
And so on. And I mean, you released much more than the Anglican Church did. The Anglican Church still restrained its choirs to being all boys. And my own story is that when I was small, I sang well. I was selected to sing "Oh Jesus, I Have Promised" in a play in the hall, but I was not allowed to sing in the choir in church because they only had boys. Nobody explained to me why I could be selected as the best singer, but not be allowed to sing in church. I only decided that because God was male, he probably preferred boys' voices. That was the only sense I could make of it, because nobody could explain why I wasn't allowed to sing in church. And that's the story of women. Some of us have survived. We're still in there.
We are still fighting the case, of course.
You know, we hang on in there, comforted by people like Hildegard, Julian, you know, the people who've been written out of the history, really. And the other person I do is Hilda of Whitby. I tell her story.
And that goes back a lot earlier, because that's back to the 7th century.
Women religious, when I used to tell it, they say, we're women religious, and we know all about Augustine and Aquinas and all the male, but we don't know anything about our female predecessors. Thank you so much for telling us the story of our female predecessors, because we only know the story of the men. Because
history is written from the center.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
You know,
I mean, it's rising now. We are hearing more of them, but it's a long, hard struggle. And when I wrote my book, In Tune with Heaven or Not, Women in Christian Liturgical Traditions, it was rejected by a publisher who said that the story of Christian music was already written and the women weren't in it. So they rejected it because the story was written by men.
When I was doing my doctoral thesis, I had an advisor, and I was doing it. I had a loose title. I was looking at spiritual direction, spiritual accompaniment in the lives of Vincent and Louise. And his first thing to me was, if I were you, I wouldn't do that. And I said, well, you're not me, and I'm doing it.
I love it.
And then he said, well, if you have to do it, you better leave her out.
No.
And I said, it's not either or, it's both and. And then I came across Janet Ruffing had one of her books. She had mentioned somebody else, a Patricia Ranft, who had written a book around 2000, 2002, somewhere there. And it was A Woman's Way, The Forgotten History of Women Spiritual Directors.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in it, she devoted a full chapter to Louise de Marillac as a spiritual director. So I was able to tell him that too.
Yeah.
It just annoyed me so much.
And there was an American songwriter, I've forgotten her name, that I worked a lot with in America, and she wanted to write a book about women's music, and her supervisor said exactly like you, there's no point in writing that book because nobody wants to hear about them. So, we've come a long way, and I have to say that Hildegard is my friend. And when I used to go to the Abbey, she used to sit on my shoulder and tell me to carry on. Because by then I'd been taught that women did not lead in music. I'd been literally taught it, but not actually said, but the fact that there were no women teaching, no women in the curriculum. The prevailing view was, I mean, there's a huge upsurge now and the stories are being written. But as you rightly say, history is his story. It's not her story. And that's still, it's still, but I mean, Vatican II did free up, Christ be our light. I mean, that's going to stay in the repertoire of all the churches for a long time. And that's Bernadette Farrell.
Farrell, that's right.
And a massive women. Some of those songs have been lost. There's really a thesis to be written on those folk singers with guitars who were released by that Vatican. Yeah. So
I just have one question. Did you watch the movie Vision on Hildegard?
That was the one.
The one by a German feminist filmmaker. I forgot the name.
Was that the one where Patricia Routledge played Hildegard?
I don't know. I don't remember. It's a German film.
Right, I think that one was all right, but the one that was written with Patricia Routledge playing Hildegard, I never felt worked.
No, I don't think it's that one. I think it's the German version. Yeah. I just wondered what you thought about the way she was depicted.
I don't remember that film, but I know with Patricia Routledge what happened. Patricia Routledge is an ironic actor, even when she's in but Keeping Up Appearances. She's almost ironic about the character she's playing, and she played Hildegard in that way. And you can't do it. Hildegard has to be convinced of what she's saying.
Yes, of course.
And also they chose her because she could sing, but in the end she didn't sing. They used recordings of Hildegard with her plucking on a dulcimer, which A, was anachronistic, but B, it didn't work. Hildegard has to be able to sing, and she has to be absolutely convinced by what she's saying, and so on. So I didn't see the German film. But I think it's a really interesting, because when Hildegard managed to get to the top of the charts, the popular charts and the classical charts at the same time, and someone in one of the programs asked me when Hildegard was going to write another song, I said I thought that might be difficult. But what they wanted me to do was to say that Hildegard would be upset that it had gone into the pop world. And that was the recording called Vision. And I wouldn't say it for them. I said, I think Hildegard would say, anything that makes the love of God clearer to people is all right.
Exactly.
I wouldn't hold the conservative line, even though. But this is, I think, the problem. And I think it's interesting, this group where we've had mostly contemporary people. But, everybody writes history from their own point of view and uses it. When I do tell the story of Mary Magdalene, done a lot of research on the lost bits of her. But at the end of it, she says, well, I'll never get my story back. People have used it in various ways, and they've used it for their own purposes. They'll do it to yours. Because that's what history does.
Yeah.
We can only see history through our own lens, and so on. And that's why it's important that women are writing about history as well as men writing about history. Because I think, yes, I mean, I'm aware that I put my slant on her, but I'm also aware that men have put their slant on her. And although I did like Feather on the Breath of God, I thought she was a passionate woman, and I guess she might have sung passionately.
So I just wanted to add, we're almost at the end, so it's a little parenthesis. So we've just seen the Tavares Tron exhibition at the Hayward Gallery.
Oh, right.
And he's a Bahamian artist. And one of the things that he does through art is writing invisible histories. So a lot of his practice is about digging out histories of Black people that have been buried by, the white man narrative of, what we know. So one of the themes in his, he's got a massive, artistic production. He's somebody who's interested in many, many things. But one of the things that are presented at this exhibition is the history of this Black astronaut.
Oh, yes.
Who never made it to the moon because he died during a training session. So he never made it to the moon. But his name has been completely, not necessarily erased, but forgotten by the NASA history and so on. And the next Black person to be trained as an astronaut was like, I don't know, 4 decades later or something. So it took, and the widow of this man got a lot of racist letters from people that they were glad that he didn't make it to the moon. So that's kind of, it's really about the invisible histories that are not told.
Well, I mean, I'm a Foucauldian, and Foucault says, those who have power write the stories. Interestingly, for the next 2 days, the church, I'm doing something called Arts for Sanctuary in the church, and we've got paintings, and we've got music, and we've got a golden tent where people can lie and just be and listen to the sounds and talk to the artists. So it's freeing up the church. And we've got people with disabilities, we've got asylum seekers and refugees, we've got people with learning difficulties. So all the outsiders are now included in the Arts for Sanctuary. I've never done anything on that scale before, and I've never tried curating a visual exhibition as well as a music one. And I'd be grateful for your prayers or strength to make it work, because on Saturday people can just come and be who they are. They can sit and meditate or pray, or they can listen, or they can go and talk to the artists. And I'm trying to make the space a place where people can be whatever they want to be. And it's my sort of experiment in getting the outsiders in. And that's part of the Wandsworth Festival. But it's a big experiment, really.
That's great.
I mean, because as you say, it's not just women, it's the disabled, it's the other ethnicities, it's people with learning difficulties, it's the ex-prisoners, it's the asylum seekers, it's the refugees. I mean, there are masses of groups of people that are just outsiders.
Should I stop the recording now? Would that be okay?
Yeah.